And you're listening to KYRS, Medical Lake in Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. Coming at you now, it's Gary Krug with Long Waves. And I'm not sure why that's not working the way I want it to. I was hoping to play you a little bit of music right here, but let's see. Here we go. Gotta love live radio. And this week, this is December 10th, 2014. I thank you for joining, listening in today. The big story, of course, this week is the release of the Senate Committee's findings on torture. Although we don't actually get the Senate's findings on torture, we get an executive summary of the Senate's findings on torture, but that's what we get, so I suppose we have to be happy with it. But, this hit me that this was a show that I could dig in and look at some of the long waves of American policy and thinking. So today's show is called Torture and Apple Pie. Now, there are a couple of problems with the Senate Committee's findings. One is that it only addresses torture performed by the CIA and its various minions running around the world, whoever those people are. It doesn't address torture performed by members of the armed forces, by private contractors, by any of the corporate entities that are out there acting in our name doing heaven knows what. So we only have a very narrow focus on the CIA. The second problem is that it doesn't really address the many enablers of torture. It just says this went on. Rectal rehydration, stress positions, some people died, and blah, blah, blah. Third problem is it doesn't address the moral framework that allows these kinds of activities to take place. And that's going to be a crucial bit for today's show. The fourth problem is that the Senate committee findings don't really provide a framework for discussing the role of torture in United States policy and the role of torture historically in building this great nation of ours. Instead, what we get is a lot of to and fro about whether it should even have been released, about whether it damaged people, about whether it's un-American that we're even talking about violations of international law and torture and murder and things like this, because we're fighting an evil enemy. And, to fight an evil enemy, you must be evil. Well, we've also got some people who are probably justly concerned that they may be investigated or, heaven forfend, even prosecuted over these torture activities. That they issued them, they said they're okay, they invented the legal excuses, they ordered them, whatever. But, these folks really don't have to be concerned that they're going to face legal consequences for their decisions, right? However just and however needed such legal investigations and prosecutions are, these would invite a wholesale investigation and prosecution of many, many people in government and outside of government. And it would raise as well the issue of war crimes and other violations of international law. And really no one wants to go there because the facade of America is more important than anything. The facade that we're a good people, the facade that we're decent folk, the facade that we don't torture, that we're the good guys. This is the bit we keep returning to. This is the bit we keep thinking is who we are. This is our identity. And the sad truth is that's not who we are. That is not our identity. This is a consistent part of U.S. history. And it is a consistent part of U.S. policy. Torture, murder, overthrowing governments democratically elected when it suits the corporations who own the Congress, who own the government, who essentially run the world. This is who we are. So let's just own up to it. Let's admit who we are, what we do, and let's acknowledge that we do it. So if we really opened all of this up to serious thought and investigation and prosecution, think of who all would be involved. Goodness, well, Dick Cheney's right up on the list. He was a big advocate of the use of torture. Donald Rumsfeld would certainly be high on the list, the most incompetent Secretary of Defense we've ever had, and why anyone gives this guy a voice today when everything he ever did as SecDef is completely discredited. Paul Wolfowitz, the comb licker himself, another architect of torture and the use of torture as an extension of U.S. policies. George W. Bush, who was president at the time, and as Harry Truman famously said, well, the buck stops here. But let's just not limit it to the Bush administration, because we'd have to go back and look at lots of other people who had been involved in war crimes, possibly torture, we don't know, but likely, certainly war crimes. Think of Madeleine Albright, who upon being informed that the sanctions that her boss, President Bill Clinton, placed on Iraq were causing the deaths of thousands of Iraqi children every year, and that some 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a result, said, I know that, and we think it's worth it. So 500,000 Iraqi kids, it really put those on the scale, and whatever Albright and Clinton thought they were doing, it all balanced out and everything was fine. But we'd also have to dig into people like Bybee from the Bush administration and you. These were the lawyers in the White House legal team who were furiously writing memos explaining why it's not really torture, because torture comes down to the intent of the person doing it. And if you don't intend to put a person in fear of death or cause extreme pain, well, Bob's your uncle, everything's fine. And more recently, too, we would have to investigate whether these activities have continued in any form with Obama. And if we're talking about war crimes, we would certainly have to look at things like the use of drones, especially against civilian targets. We seem to be killing some 20-odd people for each terrorist that we hit, and heaven only knows if those numbers are even remotely right. What we do know is that it's a very big hammer to use on a very small nail. It's a tool that's not well suited to the purpose. And this has involved all kinds of mental gymnastics, where we've had, of course, to explain that anyone who's killed by a drone who's between the ages of 10 and 90 and is male, we can claim they were an insurgent or a terrorist or whatever and say it's all okay. Our problem as a people, our problem as a country, is that we're not prepared to admit that the problem is not this or that president, this or that person, but the problem is that this is our national history, that torture and theft and genocide are our national identity, and they're standard practices. And we see these throughout our culture, both within the United States and outside of the country. We torture people in prisons. We have more people in prisons than any country in the world, more than China. We kill those not yet of majority legally. In some states, we execute people under the age of 18. We kill the mentally handicapped. We kill the insane. We lock people into solitary confinement for minor infractions of prison rules. These are all forms of torture. Isolation to a human being is one of the worst things you can do to a person. It's one of the most horrible things. It causes even short periods of total isolation cause intense emotional distress, mental damage, and a lot of the damage people do not recover from. We shoot young black men on the streets in this country as standard policy, and very, very seldom does anyone go to jail. Do any cops get arrested or fired? We have teams that break into people's houses and kill them. Often the wrong house, because God knows the cops never get anything wrong, do they? In this country, we terrorize millions of people with poverty, with police violence, with SWAT raids, which I think is somewhere around 50,000 raids last year in this country. And we terrorize people with the ongoing theft of property, with the idea that they may suddenly be absolutely destitute, wiped out by a bank, or wiped out by some local politician or by a police force that decides they're going to seize these people's car or seize their money because they can do it. And you may have some legal recourse, but good luck getting any of it back. And we terrorize people with the disenfranchisement of constitutional rights, such as the right to vote. Many states bar felons, convicted felons, even after they've served their time, from voting. And we deny hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, their constitutional rights through deliberate gerrymandering of districts, through voter restriction laws that are there to stop people from voting illegally, which has never been a problem in this country, a very minuscule problem. So you disenfranchise hundreds of thousands who are going to support the other side. And we do all of this with the prerogative privilege of a national militarized state. This is who we are. We're like the members of a large abusive family. A family wherein there is a patriarch or a matriarch who's exceedingly abusive. And we cannot admit that we, not others, but we, are regularly beaten, literally and figuratively. We are beaten and terrorized by our own government, by our own police, by our own national agencies. Instead of admitting that this is going on, we have to dutifully sing the praises of the abuser, right? Because that's what you do. You don't want to upset the abuser, who might become even more abusive. So if you want to hold that off, you have to say everything's okay, right? He's not really a bad person. He's really very kind and generous, and he's just. And, you know, those people who are getting abused, those others, deserved it. Daddy's always right. That's the position we're in as a people. This is our unspoken, unacknowledged national ethos. Terrified, abused children in our own homes. The abuse of others in the community is the lesson to us, the lesson of our fate. Should we fail to sing the right song, stand up at the right time when the right music is played, be sufficiently deferential to power, we will be like those others we see being beaten, imprisoned, tortured, deprived, and nobody wants to go there. Don't upset Daddy. In fact, the history of the United States, the history of the North and South American continents, is a study in murder, terrorism, extortion, theft, torture, you name it. Right? Who can forget the ethnic cleansing of the first people in the U.S., the first persons? Well, apparently all of us. And, you know, it's just not part of our consciousness that these things ever happened. Or if they did, that was a long time ago. That was somebody else. No, that was us. That was us. and these same sorts of exercises against native people continue in this country. I mean, drive over to Pine Ridge. Drive over to the reservation. Look around. Look at the poverty. Look at the reports on the poverty of the Native Americans, on the abuse of Native Americans in this country. I mean, certainly black people have it bad here, and Native Americans have it much worse. I mean, for example, right now, as I speak, there has been inserted into the National Defense Authorization Act, which gives the Army and the spooks all their money, which is a must-pass bill. You can't deprive the Army of its money. Oh, no. Inserted into this is a portion that hands over some U.S. land to a subsidiary of that global human rights and ecological train wreck of Rio Tinto, which is called Resolution Copper. Now, for those of you who don't know Rio Tinto, they have a stellar reputation around the world. And by around the world, I mean Australia, Mozambique, Madagascar, Mongolia, Bougainville, Indonesia, Utah. They poison water, they steal land, they lock out unions, they engage in strike breaking, and now Resolution Copper, a subsidiary of the Australian company Rio Tinto, wants to mine the burial, medicinal, and ceremonial lands of the Apache people in Arizona. So they tried to push this bill through the U.S. House twice. It failed both times. It's a bad bill to take government land that's in active use and cared for and is deeply culturally important to the Apache people, to take this bill and hide it inside the National Defense Authorization Act. And this is getting remarkably little publicity. But here you go. Stealing from the first people. Bribery in Congress. Why else is this being done unless senators are profiting personally from it? Their families, they've got job guarantees when they get out. They get donations for their campaign. Bribery and simony. Now, there's a word for you. Simony. Look it up. Corruption in public. But the real reason we have trouble is that we have trouble with the Native Americans with understanding this bill, is that we really don't have a sense of the sacred, except as a sort of abstract belief about God or heaven or Jeebus or something. An abstract belief. We don't have a living sense of the sacred, that land could be sacred, that water could be sacred, that air could be sacred. It's not real for a nation of materialists who are hiding from self-awareness and self-understanding in all kinds of magical thinking about end times, or in the pursuit of things that will provide them happiness and stand as markers of success. Success. They've made it. They're good people. They've got enough conspicuous consumption going on that folks look at them and go, hey, I'm envious. We have to remember, though, what the American psychologist William James said about success. He observed that our national disease comes from our exclusive worship of the bitch goddess success. His words. Our national disease comes from the exclusive worship of the bitch goddess success. And the pursuit, the worship of that goddess prevents us from ever acknowledging our failures. We never do anything wrong. We never do anything, as George Bush famously said, I will never apologize for the United States. Now think for a minute. Think about anybody you know in your life who will not apologize for anything. We're back to the abusive head of a household, aren't we? Never apologize, never admit you're wrong, and so you never grow. One never develops self-understanding. One never develops the empathic understanding of others that requires the reciprocity of care and the necessity, sometimes, of forgiveness. Neither can we acknowledge the failures of our methods or the failures of our morality and the humanity that these reveal. Look at the Middle East. There were some countries there that were bad. There are always some countries somewhere that are bad. We've turned the place into a hellhole. We've destroyed Iraq. We destroyed Libya. Now we're working really hard on destroying Syria. These are our successes. Afghanistan, we've been in Afghanistan over 10 years. We're going to be there probably forever until we just get tired of it and declare victory and leave. We can't acknowledge our failures. We can't say, oh, that didn't work. Because to do so would be to admit that we are fallible and that all of that treasure and all of that blood was spilt for a mistake. Deny, deny, deny. This is what the abused in every relationship do. They're locked into patterns of denial. So let's just think for a minute. Think about the long waves of these patterns. Did we forget Colonel James Steele? Now, pause for a moment and let's see if you can recall Colonel James Steele. He was one of our special people that we sent to El Salvador back in the day. And he was going to implement a plan to make El Salvador a little bit safer for the corporations that wanted to do business there. In other words, eliminate trade unions, socialists, anybody who might oppose the wholesale theft of a country's wealth and labor. So Colonel James Steele went down there and implemented a plan, and we gave the Salvadoran government lots and lots of guns and training at the School of the Americas. And ultimately this plan killed tens of thousands of civilians. Tens of thousands. Most of them just disappeared. Los desaparecidos. They just disappeared. And seeing a need for that special kind of consensus building that Colonel Steele was so very good at, the Bush administration sent him to Iraq. And what happened after Colonel Steele got to Iraq? We started seeing the militia wars. The militia wars, which destabilized the country and eventually evolved into the mess we now see nightly or daily. So, did we forget that not that terribly long ago, in 2009, in fact, and I know that's light years for some people, that's decades, but in 2009, 23 CIA agents, including the station chief in Milan, were convicted in absentia. Of course, they wouldn't show up for the trials. They were convicted in absentia for kidnapping Mullah Omar off the street and flying him out of the country, drugged and shackled for torture. 23 CIA agents were convicted. The only conviction, to my knowledge, that's ever been made regarding the kind of fun and games the CIA's been practicing. CIA torture. Oh, we're shocked to find out gambling's going on here. We've known about the CIA torturing in overseas and parts of their program since at least 2005. That's 9 years. Since at least 2005, we've known about the torture. So what's the difference now? Why now is it we all talking about the torture? Well, the because the U.S. Senate has officially documented these activities of the CIA. So we can't blame it on a handful of grunts at Abu Ghraib. It's not a handful of rogue agents. It's the CIA, and it's the leadership of this country. But again, we always knew this. The history is there. Dick Cheney talked about having to turn to the dark side. I mean, Darth Vader himself. Give yourself to the dark side, Luke. Remember Bybee and you and Gonzalez? We knew about the black sites where people who were what they euphemistically called rendered, where they would kidnap people off of the streets, put them in private-looking CIA jets, no official marks, and fly them somewhere to a variety of places where the U.S. apparently had black sites running where these people could be tortured with impunity. In places like Egypt, Jordan, Poland, Thailand, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and let's not forget Syria is one of the places we used to send people to be tortured back when they were our friends. A former operative for the CIA, a gentleman named Bob Baer, who's rather eloquent on some of his experiences, said famously, and I quote, "If you want someone tortured, you send them to Syria. If you want someone to disappear, never to be seen again, you send them to Egypt." So, yeah, torture, send them to Syria. Oh, you want this guy just to disappear? Okay, Egypt will take care of that for you. We knew about this. We knew about James Mitchell and Michael Jessen, Spokane-based psychologists who wrote the manual on torture and whose company got $80 million for this. This continues to blow my mind that Mitchell and Jessen, who had no experience in interrogation, no knowledge of Arabic language or culture, got $80 million to reverse engineer the SEER manual on torture using basically Chinese communist techniques and teach the CIA how to perform them. And they had no special knowledge in this area at all. So were the techniques ineffective? Of course they largely were. Once again, arrogance breeds incompetence. And in 2005, the FBI was saying such techniques are wholly ineffectual, and their techniques work so much better. But we forget. We forget. We forget about the renderings of people like Masri. We forget about the people like the Egyptian-born Australian citizen Mahmoud Habib, who was seized by a CIA team in Pakistan in 2001, who was sent to Egypt, where he was burned, electrocuted, and beaten till he bled in his sleep from his nose, mouth, and ears. Well, after a bit of that, we dump him in Guantanamo, and then he was released without being charged. Or Mahamdo Olad Slahi, a Mauritanian and a former Canadian resident who was taken by the CIA to Jordan for interrogation for 8 months. He was sent to Guantanamo and released. Or Madni, an Egyptian imprisoned by Indonesian authorities, flown to Egypt for interrogation, returned to the CIA 4 months later, held for 13 months in Afghanistan, then sent to Guantanamo and later released. Or Meir Arar, a naturalized Canadian citizen, kidnapped in New York in September 2002. He was taken to Syria, held in a coffin, and tortured with metal whips. He proved to have no ties to terrorism and was released. But this is the kind of thing that happens when you have no process, when you have no due cause, when you act extra-legally. You pick people up on hunches, whims. Oh, that name's kind of like the name of that other guy. We better hold him and torture him for a while. We knew. We've known since 2005, if not earlier. And even more recently, There was the UN report on U.S. human rights abuses from 2014. And that's kind of a big thing. In addition to criticizing other policies related to military engagement abroad, the committee slammed the U.S. for many of its domestic policies, including prolonged solitary confinement of those in prisons, which we already talked about, charges of prolonged suffering for those exposed to botched state executions, heavy-handed and discriminatory policing practices in the nation's cities, the treatment of juveniles in the criminal justice system, and serious problems with immigration enforcement policies. So we've known who we are. We've known what we do. We have the history. Why are we even surprised anymore? The UN also spoke about shooting deaths of especially black men in the United States. The frequent and recurrent police shootings or fatal pursuits of unarmed black individuals, as they put it. One of the members of the panel said, "We recommend that all instances of police brutality and excessive use of force by law enforcement officers are investigated promptly, effectively, and impartially by an independent mechanism." Well, where does that happen? I mean, really, who investigates police shootings? The DA, who work with the cops all the time? Other cops who also work with the cops all the time? This is who we are. And now we've got the CIA Senate torture report. Or as I say, we have the executive summary of the CIA torture report. And as it's being released, we get the sorts of statements we expect to get from abusers. Abusers like Bush, abusers like Cheney. I mean, there's George W., who, before the report was even released, said, and I quote, "CIA torturers are patriots." Let that sink in a minute. CIA torturers are patriots. Isn't this the same guy who as late as 2007 was saying we don't torture? Yeah, that was him. But they're patriots. It's like saying serial murderers are patriots. CIA torturers are patriots. He goes on to say, Bush went on to say, and whatever this report said, if it diminishes their contributions to our country, it's way off base. Now let's parse that for a moment. Whatever this report said, if it diminishes their contributions to our country, it's way off base. So what do we have here? Utilitarian logic? The ends justify the means? Well, look at the ends. We have a region in flames. We have a world in which the U.S. moral and social capital is falling like a Depression era bank. So it diminishes their contributions to our country. So we're back to this denial. If it speaks to anything that makes us look less perfect, less good, less pure, less righteous, less just, then we can't go there. This is what all abusers say. Can't say that daddy's beating the kids. As an illustration of a denial as an embrace of an immoral, vulgar, and ultimately bestial position. Gentle listeners, may I give you the radio host and former Republican Representative Joe Walsh. This guy is a piece of cake. Just this week, he said that anyone who participated in torture techniques such as rectal force feedings or chaining prisoners naked to the floor were, quote, American heroes. People who participated in rectal force feedings or chaining prisoners naked to the floor, where some of them died, are American heroes. And the funny thing is, if you dig through that report, there are some sections in there that describe the reactions that many of the interrogators, torturers, were using, the effect that these techniques had on them. They didn't do well. Decent people don't torture well. It exacts a horrible emotional and psychological price out of them. If you want good torturers, you want psychopaths. They're going to have a good time doing it. But if you take ordinary folk, no amount of training you can give them can so remove the person in front of them from humanity that they do not feel a part of themselves die when they torture them. And to use these terms like rectal hydration, rehydration, I mean, that's the kind of phrase. I'm trying to think of an analogy here. The only thing I can come up with that's similar would be to say, if you cut out someone's tongue, you could say that you were doing speech repression. I mean, there's a similarity there. Rectal force feedings, chaining prisoners naked to the floors. So even when the report was released by the Senate Intelligence Committee, after being delayed and delayed and delayed forever and ever, amen, the same former Republican Representative Joe Walsh had to tweet, because he just can't keep his mouth shut about such things. He said, "Good, no big deal. Now go focus on defeating the Islamic enemy." Go focus on defeating the Islamic enemy. No big deal. Okay, I beat up the kids and beat up the wife, but, hey, we got to get on with life here, so we've got important stuff to do. Let's get to it. He had an interview this week with CNN, and Walsh said, quote, "I'm glad they put the report out. I'm glad, though, because I don't think we should be ashamed of what we put out. Again, we're fighting an evil enemy. There are times when we need to get our hands dirty when we fight that enemy." Well, going back to Mr. Baer, who I was citing earlier, Bob Baer, former CIA. In fact, he ran a big chunk of the CIA program in Iraq before Bush got involved in it and decided that he and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz knew better. And Baer remarked in an interview that good intelligence depends on relationships. Good intelligence depends upon building relationships with communities so people will talk to you, so people will tell you things, so people will think you're one of the good guys, and hopefully you are. You're one of the good guys, and you're going to do the right thing here. It's similar to the approaches that actually work in interrogation, where you put a person at ease. You make them feel important. Sometimes stroke their ego. You empathize with them. I understand you're a good person and you're just trying to help your people. You build relationships. When you torture people, they will tell you whatever you want to hear just to make it stop. Occasionally, you might get a good piece of intel out of it, but it will be buried in them telling you anything you want them to say. We tortured people until they had to sign confessions they'd never even seen. That's in the report. This is who we are as a nation. So think about this bit that Walsh said. We're fighting an evil enemy. Well, there's classic Bush doctrine kind of language. Evil. We're fighting evil. It's not political. It's not a disagreement. It's evil. Nonsense. Nonsense. We're pretty selective in the way we throw around the word evil. ISIS chops some heads off of people. Saudi Arabia does it every week, puts it on TV. They just don't show it over here. You can find it. Go to YouTube and look around for Saudi executions. It's not hard. You can turn it over. But we don't call the Saudis evil. We bomb villages. We bomb weddings. But we're acting on the side of righteousness and goodness. And any act is justified because we're acting for the right reasons. We're fighting evil. Well, this is quasi-theological. They're not the evil enemy. They're a bunch of disenfranchised teenagers for the most part. And let's not remember where most of the extremism in the Arab world came from. It came from the United States. It came from Saudi Arabia, working with us. We built the Mujahideen. And we built the Free Syrian Army, and I'm not even sure who we're supporting in Syria anymore. Let's go back to George Walsh again, though. So he's being interviewed by CNN's Carol Costello. And she says, quote, "Is an American hero someone who is instructed by our government to conduct rectal forced feedings on a prisoner, or chain someone naked to a concrete floor until he dies, or nearly drown them 2 to 3 times a day? Is that the definition of an American hero?" "It may be, Carol. May be part of the job description," said Walsh. To which Ms. Costello said, "Really?" Walsh replied, "Absolutely. We forget as Americans who we're dealing with. Gotta be frank. We're dealing with animals. We're dealing with groups of people who behead, blow up, exterminate people." All right, well, I'd already dealt with behead, blow up, and exterminate. So let's look at that other bit there. We're dealing with animals. This is another classic propaganda technique to dehumanize the enemy, to turn the enemy into something that is so other from who we are that the laws of humanity, the historical principles of philos, of the love you owe other people simply because they are people, that none of this applies to them, and they can be killed with impunity. I heard the same nonsense about the Viet Cong. I heard the same nonsense about the Russians growing up. It's B-flat propaganda. We're dealing with animals. No, Joe, we're not. We're dealing with people whose mothers weep, whose children die, who feel in their hearts probably more than you do, sir. So there you have it. And let's follow through the logic. So Ms. Costello then says, "So we should be animals." Joe Walsh replied, "The way to defeat an animal, Carol, is oftentimes to act like one." Well, there you have it. We're animals because our enemy are animals. We're animals because our enemy are animals. We have become what we fight. The immortal words of Pogo back from the Vietnam War, we have met the enemy and they are us. Costello did go on, though, just have to say, she did go on and pointed out that the U.S. had acted like animals during Abu Ghraib, and that we were torturing there, and she did point out that, well, it didn't actually stop anything. But this is where we are. Now, the first step to overcoming any kind of psychological problem or relationship problem is to recognize that one has a problem. So our first step is to recognize that we have a problem, to face it directly and without equivocating. We need to quit listening to the abusers who are telling us they're doing the right thing, because they're not, and we know they're not. We need to face it directly. Our country is built on theft, murder, torture, and lies of convenience. This is not only something that happened in our childhood or long, long ago. It's something that continues to the present day. We executed Japanese officers after World War II for waterboarding. But now it's not torture. We used waterboarding widely in the Moro insurrection in the Philippines in the early 20th century. But now it's not torture. It continues to the present day. Now, just as those who are beaten or raped as children and adolescents often tend to continue finding themselves in abusive relationships, so we, as a people, continue with the patterns of damage and pain and destruction from long ago. We lash out with that same anger. Abusers come from abusive relationships. Abusers come from abusive pasts. They're not created ex nihilo. They're not pulled from the air. They're not spun out of fairy floss. They come from abusive relationships. If you have a society that is abusive, that you live in, some of the people around you, and perhaps you yourself, will tend to identify with the abuser. Look around. Are we a just people? Do we practice justice equally among us? Look around. Are we a charitable people? Look around. Are we a kind people? Look around. Are we forgiving? You know, it's funny. I don't think we are a terribly forgiving people. We are too easily driven to rage and vengeance by slights real and imagined. What I do find odd is that so many people around the world whom this country has wronged tend often to forgive us. Now, seeing our past clearly, we must resolve to be better, to do better. We must free ourselves from the malicious violence of our current family. We must free ourselves from the malicious violence. This starts with saying no. Like all people in abusive relationships, like all people who have been raped, molested, misused by those with momentary power over them, we have lost our voice to say no, to resist with every fiber in our being. The voice was beaten out of us, like those good little children who are too terrified to speak up. The voice was beaten out of us, but the rest of us learn the lesson vicariously. More than our voice, we've lost the sense that we have a right to live otherwise. We've lost the sense that we have a right to say no. We have a right to say no. More than that, we must give ourselves the permission to say, no, I will not be this. I will not become an abuser. I will not stand by when people around me are abused and do nothing or say nothing. We have to give ourselves permission to resist, to fight with all our strength, to fight as if the battle in front of us is the one battle we must win, because truly it is. We have only one other possible future: that we continue to fail as a nation, that we continue to fail as a people, that we continue to fail as human beings, and that in so doing, we abandon forever the ideals we so piously espouse and continue our descent into a nation of brutes. Find your voice. Give yourself permission. Daddy will be upset, but those who love you will delight in your freedoms. And you've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug. I want to play you, as I go out, a little piece by Negativland, and it's called The Bottom Line. So if all the gadgets work properly for me, I'll put it on. I want to remind all of you I'll be back next week at 3 o'clock with another live broadcast, and remind you again that you're listening to KYRS Medical Lake Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 on your FM dial. Follow me on Facebook. That's Long Waves Radio. And there will be podcasts of the broadcast linked on Facebook. They're currently buried in a YouTube. So until next week, I bid you a very pleasant good afternoon and goodbye.
I'm sitting there on Sunday morning in the chief of police's office at a large table.
Torture.
He was listening to a football game.
Let's be upfront about it.
A football game.
Torture. Torture.
On a small transistor radio.
That's the bottom line these days.
And I had it very low.
It's replaced death. Even teenagers kill themselves these days, along with the depressed and terminally ill.
And I began to hear
Death's a release from pain and anxiety and humiliation.
this very low,
Value, reward.
very low wailing sound.
But the threat of death just isn't enough to control people, so the ante's been raised.
Coming through the walls.
Now, it's torture.
Then it got louder.
And high-tech torture at that.
Then it got louder. And it was a low sound.
As the technocrats say, it's functional.
The chief of police told the colonel to turn up the radio.
That's why everyone who's intelligent and unanesthetized enough to care has sort of put their life on hold.
Then the sound got louder.
Underneath all the defensive layers of denial,
Turned to
we're all afraid of being tortured,
anguish.
or homosexually gang raped, or having it happen to someone we care about.
Screaming.
We're all self-consciously living a
And
lie.
I knew what it was.
We're all happy Joes.
And I knew that this man was being tortured with
How did it happen here in the land of the free and the home of the brave?
electricity.
I mean, in some banana republic,
Well, it kept getting louder
some distant past like the Spanish Inquisition,
and more horrible.
World War II, the Nazis, the fanatical Japs,
And each time,
but not us Americans.
and each time,
G.I. Joe,
and each time,
Frank Sinatra,
and each time,
Jerry Lewis, Autumn in New York,
the chief would tell the colonel
baseball,
to turn up the radio.
college football, Glenn Miller.
Pretty soon,
Somehow it doesn't fit with torture.
pretty soon the radio was very, very loud.
But it does, of course it does.
I could still hear those sounds.
Because it was always a facade, the image of America. And now the facade has finally failed,
Anguish.
like a burned out clutch
Screaming.
or a decayed tooth that breaks open.
Horrible.
They both smell bad, strange, ominous.
Going back to the office in the embassy, naturally I was speculating who that possibly could have been.